"I never want kids," he told his wife. She left, pregnant. 3 years later, he found her, with twins. Christian Blake had spent his entire life building walls that no one could climb. As the CEO of one of the largest medical tech firms in the country, he was the definition of composed, precise, and emotionally unreachable. Every decision he made was calculated, every word he spoke measured. He believed in control above all else, and that belief had made him unimaginably successful. He was admired by his peers, envied by competitors, and feared by anyone who dared to challenge him. What he wasn't, however, was open, especially when it came to love, vulnerability, or the idea of family. His wife, Olivia, had always seen beyond that carefully polished exterior. When they met, she was a rising PR consultant hired for a temporary project at his company. She didn't fall for his power or his wealth. What drew her in was the glimpses of something buried beneath the surface, a deep sadness, a longing he never spoke of. Against her better judgment, she fell for him quickly, and to her surprise, he let her in. At least, he let her in enough to believe it meant something. They married after just 6 months. The wedding was small, elegant, and free of the kind of drama Christian avoided like a disease. Olivia was glowing with hope, dreaming of a home filled with warmth, laughter, and eventually children. Christian never spoke about kids. He didn't shut the idea down at first, but he didn't embrace it either. Olivia assumed it was fear or uncertainty, something time and love would heal. She discovered she was pregnant on a rainy Monday morning, completely alone in the bathroom, holding a test in her shaking hands. The news was overwhelming, beautiful, terrifying, life-altering. Her first instinct was joy. Her second was fear. Not for herself, but for how Christian would react. She rehearsed 1,000 ways to tell him, imagined a dozen possible outcomes, but none of them prepared her for what he said one evening over dinner, before she had uttered a word. "I never want children," he said, without looking up from his plate. His voice was calm, his tone final. "I've seen what it does to people. The sacrifice. The chaos. I don't want that kind of life. Ever." Olivia felt the air leave her lungs. Her fork slipped from her hand and clattered against the plate. He didn't even flinch. The words hung between them like a curtain made of steel. She tried to speak, to argue, to find something to say that would bridge the space between her and the man she thought she knew. But nothing came. Her hands cradled her still flat belly under the table as her heart cracked quietly inside her chest. She didn't sleep that night. She stared at the ceiling in their pristine penthouse apartment, listening to the city outside, to the sound of her future collapsing. By dawn, she knew what she had to do. She wouldn't force him into fatherhood, wouldn't beg for love or fight for space in a life where she was clearly unwelcome now that the truth was in her heart. So the next morning, while he was at work, she packed a suitcase. She left behind the luxury, the silence, the cold marble of their shared world. She didn't leave a letter. She didn't send a message. She just vanished. She didn't know what the next chapter would look like, only that she wouldn't live in fear of someone else's rejection. She was carrying 2 lives inside her, twins, though she didn't know that yet, and they deserved a life where they were wanted. As she watched the skyline disappear from the back window of a cab heading out of the city, Olivia made a silent promise: even if she had to do it alone, her children would know love. And they would never hear the words, "I never want you," come from the lips of the person who was supposed to protect them most. Olivia didn't look back as the cab carried her away from the life she had once built with Christian. She pressed her forehead to the cool glass window, the pulse of the city fading behind her, replaced by open highways and a sky that seemed far too wide for her current state of mind. She didn't cry, not then. The grief sat in her chest like a stone, heavy and unmoving, but she had no energy left to weep. There was only one priority now: keeping herself and the child inside her safe. At least, That's what she believed until her first ultrasound a week later in a modest women's clinic on the outskirts of a quiet Oregon town. Twins. She stared at the screen in disbelief, the technician's gentle smile softening the blow of those two simple syllables. 2 heartbeats, strong and steady, thudded from the monitor like a song she hadn't expected to hear. Olivia's throat closed, and this time the tears did come. Not out of fear, not exactly. More out of awe, and the overwhelming realization that this journey would be even harder than she'd thought. But she wouldn't turn away. She wouldn't run. She rented a small cottage on the edge of town, not far from a nature preserve where the air always smelled like pine and wet earth. It was a fixer-upper, creaky floorboards, peeling paint, and a temperamental water heater, but it was hers. For the first time in years, she had a space that felt like it could become home. She picked up remote work in marketing and content writing, freelancing for small brands and local businesses. It wasn't glamorous, and the pay was far from what she was used to, but it kept her afloat. As her belly grew, so did her resilience. She decorated the nursery herself, painting the walls a soft sage green, sewing little curtains, and setting up 2 cribs side by side. Claire, her childhood best friend who had moved to the area a few years prior, showed up almost daily with groceries, advice, and open arms. Olivia hadn't told her everything, only that the father wasn't in the picture and that it was for the best. Claire didn't push for details. She just stayed, and that made all the difference. The pregnancy was hard. There were days Olivia couldn't move without pain, nights when the weight of her growing body kept her awake, and mornings when nausea returned despite being well into the 2nd trimester. Still, she endured it with a quiet kind of strength, the kind that wasn't dramatic or loud, but steady, patient, and full of quiet determination. The girls arrived one rainy evening in late spring, just after a thunderstorm had rolled over the valley. The labor was long, brutal, and complicated, but Olivia never let go of her resolve. When Lily was placed in her arms, wide-eyed and squirming with a shock of soft brown hair, Olivia broke down entirely. And when Violet followed 2 minutes later, identical to her sister but with a slightly more stubborn cry, she felt something inside her finally settle. They were beautiful. They had Christian's eyes, bright green, sharp, unmistakable, but none of his distance. Their fingers curled tightly around hers, their breaths light as whispers, and for the first time since leaving New York, Olivia felt whole. The months that followed were both a blur and a miracle. The girls grew quickly, always close to each other, always reaching out in sleep, as if afraid to be separated even for a moment. Olivia learned how to survive on 2 hours of sleep, how to balance one crying baby on her hip while feeding the other, how to function while exhausted, worried, and completely in love. There were moments when doubt crept in, late at night, usually, when the girls were finally down and the silence in the house felt deafening. She'd lie awake and wonder if she had done the right thing. If she had robbed them of something by choosing to leave. But then she'd remember Christian's voice, so cold and certain, saying, "I never want children," and it would steel her spine again. He hadn't been ready. He hadn't wanted them. And she couldn't raise them in a world where they were seen as burdens. Still, there were times she'd catch a glimpse of Lily's smirk or the tilt of Violet's head and feel her breath catch in her throat. They were his in so many ways, and yet they were hers completely. That paradox stayed with her every day. 3 years passed this way. The girls were full of life, smart, mischievous, and endlessly curious. They loved animals, music, and helping their mother cook, though helping usually meant making a mess. Olivia poured everything she had into them, and though she still bore the scars of what had happened, she carried herself with a grace that came only from surviving the hardest things and still choosing joy. She didn't know that everything was about to change again. That fate had a way of rewriting stories when you least expect it. That sometimes, the person you least believe will return is the one you can never outrun. But for now, she let herself live in the moment, unaware that the man who had once said never was only days away from finding out exactly what he had walked away from. Christian sat at his desk overlooking the New York skyline, but the view that once filled him with pride now felt hollow. His days had grown monotonous, consumed by meetings, numbers, boardrooms, and awards that no longer brought him satisfaction. 3 years had passed since Olivia left, and though he never said it aloud, he had never truly stopped thinking about her. In the beginning, he was furious. She had vanished without a word, without a goodbye, leaving him to assume it was over because of his words. And maybe that was true. Maybe it was exactly because of what he'd said, or worse, what he hadn't. He had always been clear, or so he told himself. He didn't want children. He didn't want the chaos or loss of control. But in her silence, in her sudden absence, there had been something more. Something he hadn't been able to admit to anyone, not even to himself, that he missed her. That he had built his world so carefully to keep love out, and when it finally slipped through the cracks, he didn't know how to hold on to it. So he let her go without a fight, assuming she would come back, assuming she needed space. But space turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. And she never returned. For years, he buried himself in work, convincing himself that success would dull the ache. He dated briefly, smart, ambitious women who understood his world, but none of them looked at him the way Olivia did. None of them made silence feel safe. With Olivia, even stillness had meaning. With everyone else, it was just empty. One evening, as he was leaving a charity gala he'd sponsored, he saw a woman in the crowd with long brown hair and a familiar posture. For a heartbeat, he thought it was her. His heart stuttered, unprepared for the flood of emotion that followed. It wasn't her, of course. But that single moment unraveled something inside him. That night, he poured himself a drink and stood at the edge of his apartment, staring at the skyline. The silence felt louder than ever. He thought of her laugh. The way she'd bite her lip when she was nervous. The way she'd close her eyes when she hugged him, like she wanted to remember every second. He thought of the things he'd never said. And then, for the first time, he wondered, what if she hadn't just left him? What if she'd left because of something more? A single sentence came back to him, "I never want children." He had said it so carelessly, not knowing what she carried inside her at that moment. A slow dread bloomed in his chest. He didn't know if it was too late. He didn't know if she had moved on, if she was somewhere married or far away or happy without him. But suddenly, he needed to know. He hired a private investigator, not the kind that left trails or asked questions. He wanted quiet, precise answers. It took less than 2 weeks. The first photos nearly knocked the breath out of him. Olivia in a small Oregon town, walking down a park path with 2 little girls, identical, both around 3 years old. They had brown hair like hers, but their eyes were unmistakably his. Green, bright, and wide with curiosity. One was laughing, the other pointing at a bird in the sky. Olivia was holding both their hands. Christian dropped the file onto the floor and sat back, stunned. He had children. Not just 1, 2. Twins. He stared at their faces, unable to look away. Emotions crashed over him all at once, shock, guilt, awe, fear, and something deeper. Regret. Regret that he hadn't asked. That he hadn't looked. That for 3 years, while he built empires, his daughters had been learning to walk, speak, laugh, and live without him. He booked a flight that night. No calls, no emails. Just a plane ticket, a suitcase, and the address that would bring him face to face with the life he had never expected to find. He didn't know what Olivia would say. He didn't know if the girls would even look at him. But none of that mattered anymore. He needed to see them. To understand. To face the cost of his silence. For the first time in his life, Christian Blake didn't have a plan. Only a question he couldn't ignore any longer: what if love was the one thing he should have fought for? The flight to Oregon felt like a journey through time. Christian sat by the window, his reflection staring back at him in the glass, unfamiliar and uncertain. He had been to 1,000 destinations in his life, closed multi-million-dollar deals, stood on global stages, but he had never felt this kind of anxiety in his chest. There was no meeting agenda, no script, no assistant beside him feeding statistics. There was only the possibility of a confrontation he couldn't prepare for, and the haunting knowledge that 3 years had passed, years that belonged not only to Olivia but to the daughters he had never held, never kissed, never even named. He arrived in the small town mid-morning, the air crisp and the streets quiet. It was nothing like the world he'd come from: no skyscrapers, no horns, no rush. Just trees lining narrow roads and people who nodded when they passed. He found the park first, the one from the photos. It was modest, surrounded by tall pines, with a small playground and a path that curved around a pond. He didn't approach at first. He sat in his rental car, his hands tightening on the steering wheel as he watched a mother and her 2 daughters near the swing set. Olivia hadn't changed much. Her hair was longer, pulled back in a simple braid, her clothes soft and practical, her face older but still beautiful in a way that made his heart ache. The girls were running circles around her, one tripping and falling into her arms, the other pointing to the ducks with such animated joy that Christian had to look away. He felt something crack open inside him, something he'd locked away so long ago he didn't even remember the sound of it. He waited until the girls were distracted, chasing each other toward the grass, before he stood and walked toward her. Olivia looked up. Her eyes met his, and for a second, everything else fell away. There was no greeting, no smile. Just shock, cold and immediate. She stood slowly, as if unsure whether she was dreaming or seeing a ghost. Her posture stiffened. Her hands instinctively went to her sides, protectively scanning for the girls. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice low but sharp. The tone wasn't angry, not yet, but full of pain barely concealed beneath the surface. "I had to see you," he replied quietly. "I had to see them." Her expression faltered, and a storm passed through her eyes. "Now?" she said. "After 3 years?" Christian stepped closer, but stopped at a respectful distance. "I didn't know," he said. "I swear, Olivia. I didn't know you were pregnant. I thought you left because of what I said. I thought it was over." "It was over," she snapped, then lowered her voice as the girls turned to glance at them. "You said you never wanted children. I was already carrying them when you looked me in the eye and told me they were the last thing you'd ever want. I couldn't stay after that." "I know," he said. "And I hate myself for it." She blinked, startled by the rawness in his voice. For a moment, the armor she wore cracked. He saw her pain, but also her strength. She had built a life here, without him. A life that didn't include his name, his money, or his mistakes. The girls ran back toward her, laughing. One of them, Lily, stopped and stared up at Christian with wide green eyes. She tilted her head, curious. "Mommy, who's that?" she asked. Olivia's breath caught. Her eyes searched Christian's face for a sign, for guidance, but none came. She knelt beside Lily and smoothed a curl from her cheek. "He's someone I used to know," she said slowly. Violet approached and stood beside her sister, clutching her twin's hand. Christian knelt down too, ignoring the expensive suit, the dirt on the grass, the shaking in his hands. "My name is Christian," he said gently. "It's really nice to meet you." Lily narrowed her eyes, thoughtful in that serious way only children could be. "Do you live here?" "No," he said. "But I came a long way just to see you." Violet whispered something in Lily's ear and the two girls giggled. Then, without warning, Violet reached out and touched his tie. "It's shiny," she said, then looked back at Olivia as if seeking permission. Olivia didn't speak. But she didn't stop them either. Christian stood and looked at her. "I'm not here to take anything away," he said. "I just want to get to know them. I know I don't deserve it. But I had to try." She was quiet for a long time. Then, without meeting his eyes, she said, "We come here every afternoon." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't acceptance. But it was a beginning. Christian watched as she took the girls' hands and led them down the path, the way he had seen in those photos. But this time, he wasn't just watching. This time, he was walking behind them, with hope in his heart and the first steps of a second chance under his feet. Christian returned to the park the next day, unsure if he would see them again. He arrived early, his heart heavy with both anticipation and self-doubt. The small town moved slowly, and yet the minutes dragged like hours as he sat on the same bench near the swings where he'd first seen them. He wasn't used to waiting. In his world, things happened when he commanded them to. But now, none of that mattered. He couldn't buy forgiveness, couldn't rush healing, couldn't force Olivia to open the door he'd once slammed shut with 7 careless words. All he could do was show up. And then, just as the wind picked up and a few clouds slid across the sun, he saw them. Olivia walked hand in hand with Lily and Violet, their little feet moving in mismatched rhythm as they skipped along the path toward the playground. The girls spotted him first and broke into small, unsure smiles. Olivia hesitated before offering a small nod, the kind of gesture that didn't say she was ready to talk, but also didn't ask him to leave. It was enough. He rose, brushed off his coat, and met them halfway. The girls ran straight to the swing set, laughing and pushing each other gently while Olivia leaned against the wooden fence, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Christian stood beside her, keeping just enough distance to respect the unspoken boundaries. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. The only sounds were the girls' laughter and the distant creak of the swings. Finally, Olivia spoke, her voice measured and steady. "You're not staying long, are you?" "I don't know," he admitted. "I didn't come with a plan. I just knew I couldn't live another day not knowing them, not knowing you're all right." She turned to him slowly, eyes unreadable. "We've been more than all right. We've been surviving." "I believe that," he said. "And I can see it. You're doing beautifully with them. I would never want to undo what you've built." "But you still want to be a part of it now?" she asked quietly. "After all this time?" Christian exhaled slowly. "Yes. Not to disrupt it. Not to rewrite it. I just want to belong to it, if there's space." Olivia looked back at the girls, her jaw tightening slightly. "They don't know who you are." "I know," he replied. "And I'm not asking you to explain it today. I'd like to earn it, whatever that looks like." She nodded, but her face was still a mask. Then, unexpectedly, she walked over to the bench and sat down. Christian followed, cautiously. For the first time in years, they sat side by side in silence that wasn't sharp or painful, just fragile. She began to tell him about the girls, not as a mother defending her decisions, but as someone who had spent 3 years documenting every moment in her heart. She told him how Lily had a stubborn streak a mile wide but cried during Disney movies, and how Violet was always the first to comfort her sister when she fell. She shared how they loved blueberries, hated nap time, and adored their preschool teacher, Miss Jordan. As she spoke, Christian listened as if her words were treasure. He clung to every detail, soaking in a world he never knew he'd been missing. Then the girls ran back to them, asking for snacks, which Olivia had packed in a tiny cooler shaped like a bumblebee. Without hesitation, she handed Christian one of the containers and let him pass it to Violet. The little girl accepted it without question, sitting at his feet and eating apple slices like she'd known him her whole life. It was the smallest moment, but for Christian, it was monumental. He looked down at Violet, then at Olivia, and felt something shift inside him, not guilt, not panic, but something slower and more powerful. It was the realization that he wanted to show up not just for a moment, but for every moment. That evening, after Olivia and the girls had gone home, Christian didn't return to his hotel. He drove aimlessly through the town for over an hour, watching the sun drop behind the hills, casting gold light across old barns and quiet streets. He stopped outside a small bookstore and sat in the car, overwhelmed. His life had been clean, structured, sterile, and it had left him empty. Here, in a town where nothing was perfect, where two little girls called out for their mother and shared apple slices without pretense, he had finally found something real. He knew this wasn't redemption, not yet. But it was a beginning. And for the first time in his adult life, Christian Blake wanted to be part of something messy, complicated, and true. Not as a guest, but as a father. As the man he should have been from the very start. The following week unfolded in quiet steps. Christian kept showing up, not in grand gestures or dramatic apologies, but through consistency, presence, and humility. He arrived at the park every day, always early, always waiting. Some afternoons, he brought small picture books or puzzles tucked under his arm, unsure whether the girls would accept them. To his relief, they often did. Lily had taken a particular interest in sitting beside him while he read, occasionally interrupting to ask impossible questions, like why the clouds moved or where birds went at night. Violet, more cautious at first, began mimicking her sister's trust little by little, until eventually she asked if he knew how to draw ponies. He didn't, but he tried. Olivia watched it all unfold from a distance. She stayed on the bench, sometimes joining them, sometimes staying back with a book in her lap and her eyes carefully trained on the three of them. Christian never pressured her. He knew the more he tried to force his way in, the more likely she would close the door again. Instead, he learned the rhythms of their world, how Violet preferred her juice with no ice, how Lily loved to wear mismatched socks on purpose, how Olivia hummed when she pushed the swings, even when she didn't realize it. By the end of the second week, Olivia invited him to walk them home. It was a quiet stroll along a tree-lined path, the girls skipping ahead with laughter trailing behind them like ribbons. Olivia didn't say much, but the invitation itself was monumental. As they neared the small cottage, Christian noticed the garden blooming in the front, lavender, rosemary, wild daisies tangled together. It was beautiful, modest, and full of life. Nothing like the cold, sleek spaces he had built for himself. When she opened the gate, she turned to him and said, "They can't know yet." "Not until I'm sure." He nodded. "I'm not asking for anything except the chance to prove I can be someone worth their trust." Inside the house, everything spoke of love and effort. There were handmade drawings taped to the fridge, small shoes lined up by the door, and a soft scent of vanilla and old wood. The girls immediately ran to the living room, pulling out blocks and dolls. Olivia offered Christian a glass of water and sat across from him at the kitchen table. The distance between them was smaller now, but the weight of unspoken years still hung in the air. She broke the silence first. "You said you didn't want children. I know you regret that, but I need to understand something. Was it fear? Or was it truly who you were?" Christian leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. "I was afraid of becoming my father," he said quietly. He was cold. He saw me as an obligation. I thought if I had children, I would repeat that. I convinced myself it was safer for everyone if I never became a father at all. Olivia listened, her expression unreadable. He continued. "But I was wrong. I thought I could live without love, without mess, without risk. I built my whole life around control. And in the end, I lost everything that ever really mattered." She looked down at her hands, fingers curled slightly against the wood. "You lost me," she said. "And for 3 years, you lost them." "I know," he whispered. "And I don't expect forgiveness. But if there's a way to be part of their lives, even just a little, I will take whatever you're willing to give." A quiet settled between them, not tense, but reflective. Olivia finally nodded, not as a promise, but as acknowledgement. She stood and walked to the living room, where the girls were arguing about whose stuffed animal would win a race. Without a word, she turned back and gestured for Christian to join them. He did. He sat cross-legged on the floor beside them, letting the girls thrust tiny plush toys into his hands and assign him rules to a game he didn't understand. The afternoon passed in a blur of stories, blocks, laughter, and spilled juice. When it was time to leave, Olivia walked him to the door. She didn't say goodbye. Instead, she said, "Same time tomorrow?" And Christian, feeling the quiet weight of hope blooming in his chest, simply nodded. That night, he returned to his hotel and sat by the window with the lights off. The city was distant now, his past life dimmed by the new one unfolding in front of him. He wasn't sure where this path would lead. But for the first time in years, he felt like he belonged somewhere. Not in a boardroom or a penthouse, but on the floor of a small cottage filled with laughter and broken crayons. He didn't know how long it would take. But he would keep showing up, day after day, until Olivia, and his daughters, knew he was there to stay. Summer began to soften the edges of the little Oregon town, bathing it in golden light and long, quiet evenings. Christian had extended his stay, turning days into weeks without ever setting a departure date. He rented a small house not far from Olivia's, nothing extravagant, just a simple place with tall windows and a porch that overlooked the trees. It was the first home he'd ever chosen for reasons that weren't rooted in status or convenience. Every morning, he woke up early and walked the long trail behind the cottages, sometimes passing Olivia and the girls on their way to the park. They had developed a rhythm now, not quite a routine, but something close to it. Lily and Violet had begun asking more questions. They wanted to know why Christian always came to the park, why he remembered which juice boxes they liked, why he sometimes stared at them like he was memorizing their faces. Olivia had not yet told them the truth, but she knew that moment was approaching. And as she watched Christian each day, how he crouched beside them in the grass, how he listened, really listened, to their long-winded stories, she began to believe he might be ready to hear it from their lips, not just from hers. One afternoon, while the girls napped after a morning of playing hide-and-seek, Olivia invited Christian inside and sat him down at the kitchen table with 2 mugs of coffee. Her expression was cautious, but not guarded. She had been thinking about this moment for weeks. The question that had lingered inside her wasn't whether he loved the girls, she could see he did. It was whether he would still love them after the truth was spoken out loud, after it no longer sat safely in implication or silence. "They're old enough to start understanding," she said carefully, wrapping her fingers around the warm mug. "They already sense that there's something different about you." Christian nodded, his eyes steady. "I know. I've been waiting for you to tell me when it was the right time." "I don't think there's such a thing as a right time," she admitted. "But there is an honest one. And I think that time is now." They decided together that Olivia would tell them first, gently, in her own words. Christian would stay nearby, in the living room, in case they had questions or, if they simply wanted to run into his arms without needing words. Neither of them knew how it would go. Neither of them pretended to. That evening, the girls sat on the rug in front of the fireplace, coloring with their usual intensity. Olivia sat with them and slowly, lovingly, told them a story about a man who had once loved their mother but hadn't understood love very well. She spoke of fear and growth, of mistakes and second chances. She told them that the man they had come to know, the one who helped build castles from blocks and made funny voices when reading bedtime stories, wasn't just a friend. He was their father. The room went quiet. Pencils dropped to the floor. Violet looked confused, Lily more curious than anything. Olivia waited, heart pounding, breath tight in her throat. "Really?" Lily asked, her small voice filled with wonder, not hurt. Olivia nodded slowly. "Yes, baby. He didn't know about you when you were born. But once he did, he came." Violet blinked at her sister, then turned toward the doorway where Christian stood silently, barely breathing. "Is that why his eyes look like ours?" she asked. Christian stepped forward, kneeling beside them with more gentleness than Olivia had ever seen in him. "That's part of it," he said softly. "But mostly, it's because you're mine. Both of you. You always have been." There were no dramatic tears, no movie-perfect embrace. But the girls moved toward him slowly, Lily first, curling into his side like it was the most natural thing in the world. Violet followed moments later, leaning into his chest, quiet and wide-eyed. That night, Christian stayed for dinner. He helped clean up, read their bedtime story, and kissed the tops of their heads when Olivia tucked them into bed. They didn't call him Dad, not yet, but they called him by name with more warmth, more ownership. And for Christian, that was enough, for now. Later, when the house was quiet, he sat on the porch with Olivia, a blanket draped over her legs and a glass of wine in her hand. The stars above them shimmered in clear, perfect silence. She didn't say much, just leaned her head gently against his shoulder. "You're not the man I left," she whispered. "And I don't think I'm the same woman anymore either." Christian didn't answer right away. He simply took her hand in his, lacing their fingers together. "No," he said finally. "But maybe that's the point. We had to break apart to become the people who could do this right." And for the first time, neither of them looked away. As summer gave way to early autumn, the small town began to shift under a soft golden haze. Leaves turned amber and rust, the days grew shorter, and Olivia's cottage took on a new kind of warmth. It wasn't just the season. It was the feeling of something settling into place after years of imbalance. Christian had quietly become part of their world, not as a visitor, not as an interruption, but as someone who belonged. The girls now expected him each morning, rushing to the door when they saw his car pull up, their arms outstretched, voices overlapping with eager stories and questions. They still called him Christian, but there was something different in the way they said his name now. It was tender, instinctive, full of trust. It no longer held the distance of a stranger, but the rhythm of someone who had always been there, even if he hadn't been present in the beginning. Christian's life in New York felt like a distant echo. His assistant continued to send emails and summaries. He had delegated most of his authority, and though his board didn't understand why, he no longer cared about explaining. For the first time, he was living not for quarterly gains or market share, but for moments that couldn't be measured. Pancake breakfasts where Violet insisted on shaping hers like stars. Afternoons helping Lily build obstacle courses from couch cushions and broomsticks. Evenings when Olivia, exhausted but glowing, leaned into him as the girls fell asleep in their arms. He began documenting the small things, photos, scribbled notes, drawings the girls gave him. It wasn't to share with anyone. It was for himself, to hold on to a life he had nearly lost. One crisp October afternoon, Christian took Olivia and the girls to a harvest festival outside of town. There were hayrides, caramel apples, and a corn maze that the twins insisted on solving without help. He watched them run ahead, their laughter cutting through the wind like music. Olivia stood beside him, cheeks flushed from the cold, her scarf tangled in her hair. He turned to her and realized he didn't want to wait anymore. Not out of fear, not because of guilt, but because everything about this moment felt right. That night, after the girls had fallen asleep in the back seat on the drive home, he carried them into the house one by one, tucking them in carefully, brushing back their hair with a tenderness that no longer surprised him. Olivia waited for him outside on the porch, her arms wrapped around herself, her eyes calm but questioning. He didn't say anything at first. Instead, he took her hands, reached into his jacket pocket, and pulled out a small velvet box, not with the urgency of a man trying to fix the past, but with the quiet determination of someone ready to build a future. She didn't open it. She just looked at him, breath held in her chest, tears brimming without falling. "I'm not asking for yesterday back," he said. "I'm asking for tomorrow. For every tomorrow you'll give me. Not just as a man who loves you, but as the father I wasn't, and the one I want to be." Olivia was quiet for a long time, the autumn breeze brushing across her face, carrying memories and possibilities all at once. Then, finally, she opened the box. Inside was a ring that was simple, elegant, nothing like the one he had given her years ago. That one had been expensive and cold, a symbol of control. This one felt real, something chosen with care, with humility. She took his hand and slid the ring onto her own finger. No dramatic yes, no whispered vows. Just action, choice, trust. In the months that followed, they didn't rush a wedding. There were no grand announcements or parties. Instead, they focused on their family. Christian officially adopted Lily and Violet, and they chose to hyphenate their last names, not to erase anything, but to honor every part of who they were and where they came from. The girls began calling him Dad on their own one morning at breakfast. Christian had turned to respond and dropped his spoon, stunned. Olivia had simply smiled, eyes wet, and reached across the table for his hand. Later that year, they planted a tree in the backyard. A maple. Christian dug the hole while the girls danced around with watering cans. Olivia tied a ribbon around the trunk. It was their symbol, of growth, of seasons, of change that took root slowly but with deep, quiet strength. And every year after, as the leaves turned red and gold again, they celebrated not the moment they had met, or the moment they had fallen apart, but the moment they had all found their way back. A second beginning. A life earned, not given. A family, not in spite of what had been lost, but because of what they had chosen to build. Together. As the author, I see the ending of this story not as a perfect resolution, but as a deeply earned one. It's a story about the cost of silence, the weight of regret, and the strength it takes to grow beyond your past. Christian's journey wasn't just about becoming a father, it was about unlearning fear, choosing vulnerability, and finally understanding what love really requires. Olivia's strength carried the heart of this family through its hardest years, and her decision to forgive wasn't a weakness, but a quiet act of bravery. What moves me most is that nothing about their reunion was easy. It wasn't a fairy tale where pain is erased by a single apology. Instead, it was a slow rebuilding, moment by moment, choice by choice. The girls didn't know they were healing a man who never thought he deserved a second chance, but they did. In the end, this story reminds us that sometimes the most powerful kind of love is the one that shows up late, but stays.